Okay, there. Am I? I am in the room.
And even though they were still just
Yeah.
worried, like,
I'm supposed to talk for Jared a little bit, so he can get levels back there. So you don't have to pay attention to me. I'm just talking. When I do sound check for sermons, I always do stand up.
okay. Oh, okay.
And
Give us a.
no, I'm not going to do stand up for you. But people for a while, people would actually come to hear my stand up because everybody else gets up and they start their sermons and they're practicing their sermons. Tim goes, "Funny thing happened to me on the way." It's really true. I can't remember what I said, something that just left them. And when they give me the handheld to test that, I frequently will bust in. I'll say, I would like to do, when I have a mic like this, it just always makes me think of the man who had the most influence on me in my whole life, the rapper Sir Mix-a-Lot. And then I go into, I like big, and you stop right there, and everybody just falls out. They're just not expecting that. It's always fun.
And no electriconic stuff.
No, I'm doing that, no. It takes a little of the tension out of the room. Are you okay with me, Jared? Have I spoken enough? Well, hey, everybody. Small but mighty. I get it. I already said it to you, but I've had a lot of people who are cautiously staying away from coming out for various reasons. And that's okay. We used to do the class through the summer and not in the winter because people didn't want to drive in the dark and the cold. And then when we were off from being alive for so long, I thought I probably ought to at least not start for 6 weeks and then not do it again until we had spring weather. But fortunately, we have we have the live stream and we have the YouTube channel, and people can watch it, and they are watching it. And I'm getting requests. Today I had an email from somebody in Minnesota who watches the class regularly. Sorry, the Minnesota person, I'm talking about you, but it was a request for pronunciation of some things from Hebrew, but I didn't know that they were from Minnesota till after I'd answered, and so hey, some church. And I found there's a church somewhere, where are they, in North Carolina or South Carolina, that they use this class, they use the 30-minute, they've been using the 30-minute stuff I was doing leading up to this for their staff weekly devotional. I'm thinking, what's their pastor doing? Sorry. But, anyway. But he was really grateful for what we're doing here because it was good for them to watch it for half an hour and then talk about it. And so, hey, we might as well keep going. You guys are okay with coming, aren't you? Are you okay? All right, okay. And I'll keep having them set this up like this, even though we don't need this many seats, so you can all spread out and feel comfortable about it. All right, let me think. I think that's all I need to say. Yeah, let's pray and we'll get going. Lord, I am so thankful to be here. I thank you, Father, for the way that you have blessed us all, and I thank you that you've given us your word, and I pray, Lord, that I will take the responsibility of all that I say this evening very seriously and represent you well. Pray that what we see today in your word will be something that changes our hearts and makes us love you more and want to serve you in a deeper way, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty, now we are at verse 19 of chapter 9, and it's right in the middle of this story, this great story. I want to read the whole thing starting in verse 14 just to give us all context, and then we'll come back in, but we'll start parsing things out in verse 19. And let's start to read. It says in verse 14 of chapter 9, When they returned to the other disciples, this is Peter, James, and John, and Jesus, who have just been on the Mount of Transfiguration. When they returned to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them. And some teachers of the religious law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him. "What is all this arguing about?" Jesus asked. And one of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, "Teacher, I brought my son so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out this evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." Okay, that's where we stopped. You get the idea of what's happening. This is where we start tonight. Jesus said to them, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought the boy. But when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening?" Jesus asked the boy. And he replied, "Since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can." "What do you mean, if I can?" Jesus asked. "Anything is possible if a person believes." The father instantly cried out, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that the crowd of onlookers was growing, he rebuked the evil spirit. "Listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak," he said. "I command you to come out of this child and never enter him again." Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. And a murmur ran through the crowd as people said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. And afterwards, when Jesus was alone in the house with his disciples, they asked him, "Why couldn't we cast out this evil spirit?" And Jesus replied, "This kind can be cast out only by prayer." Now, there's a lot to say about all this, but I want us to start in verse 19 by taking note of the pronouns. The pronouns give us a look into Jesus' frame of mind at the moment. If you remember, he had asked a general question of the disciples, or so it seems. The question concerned, what are you guys arguing about? He's talking to them there. What are you arguing about with the scribes? And then one man in the crowd had answered Jesus, and his answer was both a description of the suffering of his son and a report about Jesus' disciples' inability to do anything about this evil spirit that was tormenting his son. And it's just like one man responds to Jesus' question about, "What are you arguing about?" So one guy responds, but then Jesus, he does not even initially speak to this man. All the pronouns are in the plural. The Greek says this, "And answering them, says Jesus." And we have to think about this for a minute. There's a fairly strong consensus about who them is. And it's important to think about this. Who is them? The vast majority of scholars believe that them is the disciples. That Jesus is about to speak to the disciples that he's put out because they are the ones who were not faithful enough in their thinking or in their hearts or whatever to be able to do anything about this demon. And that, because he's going to say some pretty harsh things right here at the beginning. And so this is a strong indictment of the people that have been with him all the time. They've been with him for, we don't know how long it's been exactly up until this point, but these are people who earlier, remember, earlier they had actually been given, in chapter 6, the authority to cast out demons and had done it. And so they're supposed to be faithful if that in the fact that they should be able to do this. And now, almost all the scholars think this is to the disciples, and I'm going to talk about this a lot more later, but Matthew's account of this whole story is different. And you get it 100%, that Matthew feels that who Jesus was talking to at that moment was the disciples. I'll talk about that why in a minute. But Robert Gundry, who I respect as much as any scholar in the world, disagrees with that position absolutely. He says, no, Jesus is not about to speak to them as being the disciples, but to the crowd, the people mostly, and that man specifically. And the reason he says this is because what Jesus is about to say is not something that is unknown to the people broadly, because I'll tell you why in a minute. But also, when we get to the backside of this whole story, and Jesus, did you notice they were alone with Jesus later? And they say, why couldn't we cast him out? He doesn't go, because you are so freaking faithless. He doesn't say that, does he? He doesn't say anything to that effect. He goes into a completely different space. He doesn't criticize them at all for their faithlessness. So Gundry thinks that Jesus is talking to the crowd when he says, does this make sense? You see what I'm saying about this? This is important. And I guess I should stop now and tell you why I think Matthew and Peter have different views of what is going on here. In Mark, since it's Peter talking about this, right? It's Peter telling us this story through Mark. Peter has just come down from the mountaintop. He has no dog in this argument hunt. He didn't try to cast out this demon. He's an observer to this moment, and his thinking is going to be, why would I use this opportunity to denigrate my fellow brothers? Does this make sense? Why would I use this opportunity to denigrate them? Because the crowd is actually, in the end, the people who turned on Jesus. Matthew, on the other hand, when he writes about it, you get a clear picture that Jesus is talking directly to the disciples here. Why would Matthew take this personally? Because he's one of the people who couldn't cast the demon out. And so he's seeing this whole event as a personal moment in his own life where he had to think about his faithfulness in relationship to what Jesus talks about. And so I think Matthew coins the stuff that he says in a way, it's different. It's even in Matthew's gospel, this is where Jesus says, if you wanted to throw a mountain into the sea, if you had a mustard seed's worth of faith, you could have thrown a mountain into the sea. That's where he puts this. Clearly, this moment had a huge impact on Matthew in terms of his thinking about his own personal faith in this one he's been following, when he's thinking about it 30 years later. Peter, on the other hand, he's not thinking about it. And what Jesus says there is he says, you faithless people, and I just want to, and I've got tons of notes on the difference. It says, you faithless people. The first word in the Greek is just one word, and it's essentially O. There it is. O. It's like, and that one letter, see where it's in the translation O? That is a common Greek word that is, it's actually an expression of tremendous, how would I say it? Heartbreaking exasperation. It's like what somebody says when they go, something comes up and they go, oh, like that. That's what he says. It's not like, oh, you heartless. It's, oh. Now, there's an interesting aspect of this, and this is not true in this particular passage. But almost every other time we read that Jesus says, now you got to follow me on this, because it connects to this. Almost every time Jesus says, "O you of little faith." You heard Jesus say that? "O you of little faith." The Greek is not, it's not "O you of little faith." It's "O you," and in a proper noun, little faiths. It's a statement that is almost, and I'm really agree with this, but many scholars believe that Jesus is not accusing them of being people of little faith. What Jesus is doing is he's reminding himself that it is almost impossible for us to build faith within us. And here's why. We were not, if you've heard me say this, you can, but we were not created to have faith. And we were not created to have hope. Why? We didn't need faith because we were created to see God face to face. Our innate being, our existential, soulful reality is that we were created to see God face to face and never have to have faith that he actually exists or cares for us. Also, we were created to live in the presence of God, and that he was to be the one who was managing the affairs of the world. When God manages the true affairs of the world in his own world, there is no need for hope. Because the hope is no, why do we need to hope for something? Because we know it's always present and real. That's what we were created for. That's our nature. One other place, Paul says that there's hope and there's faith and there's love, and the greatest of these is what? Love. Why does he say that? Because we were also created for love, and we can do that in this. It's the greatest. There will be some day when there is no need for faith or hope, but love will exist forever. Thus, all the emphasis on agape throughout the New Testament, because we are all moving to a world that is faithless and hopeless because they're unnecessary. And when Jesus says, "Oh, you little faiths," it's a reminder of the human Jesus that he's dealing with a population of people who have almost no ability to gin up faith because we weren't created with the ability to do it. Does this make sense? And so it's like he's going, "Oh, you of little faith," like remember. And then he says, how much faith do we need? A mustard seed, because that's about all we can actually create. Outside of the power of the Holy Spirit, mankind has no innate ability to create faith. Not the kind that we need to function in this world. Now that should give you hope. Because you know what the first thing happens when people have something, Grandpa gets sick and everybody prays for him and he dies, and what do people lose? Their faith. They apply for a job and they think it's the perfect job for them and they don't get it, and they prayed for it, and then what do they lose? Their faith. Why? Because we can't gin up enough of it. We can't create up enough of it to keep moving. There's a lot of stuff about, I know this is somewhat off the grid, but when Jesus says to you, "Oh, you faithless people," that's exactly what, he doesn't say people, he says generation. And the important reason for us to know that he says, "Oh, you faithless," Matthew has him say, "and perverse generation." Now, I don't know whether Jesus said perverse or not. It's very strong in the text. like the affirmation of it being really in the text is strong. But that phrase is all over the place in the Old Testament in the prophetic talk. "Oh, you faithless generation. And the primary faithless generation is the generation of the Exodus. And we get the faithlessness of that generation frequently. They're the ones who came out of Egypt and who then did not get to go into the promised land. Now, the reason that they are connected to this generation is, who did that generation see face to face? God himself on the mountain. Who did that generation see God do amazing miracles for? That generation. What's the next generation that saw God face to face and saw amazing miracles? This one. Because there's Jesus in their presence doing amazing things, and they don't have the capacity to trust him. Does this make sense? So that he uses a phrase, "Oh, you faithless generation," and here's one other thing. We're going to be talking about faith in here and belief. The word that gives us faith in the Greek is pisteo. It is the exact same word that gives it. Faith and belief are our concepts. I do not know how to explain this to you, but when a translator gets to the word, the forms of pisteo, he has to decide whether, to us, these people need faith or they need belief. Because in English, believing something and having faith are two very different things. When I say I believe something, it's because I have some sort of concrete knowledge that it's true. It's something that I can I can go with it. I believe that the earth is round. I believe that if I drive the speed limit, I won't get, well, that's not necessarily true, but I won't get pulled over. But you know what I'm saying? When you believe something, it's because you base it on something concrete. But when you have faith in something, that's sort of a hopeful wish that they did it before, I think they'll do it again, or I'm being faithful. Those are different things in our thinking, but they're only one word in the Greek. Somehow that is, and I got to tell you, I don't even know how to think about it. We need a third word, and we don't have it. And so every time, like, he could have said, "Oh, you non-believing generation," and it would have been a proper translation. And later on, when he says, when the guy says, I don't have any, help me, I'm unbelief. He says, help me in my unbelief. That word is pisteo. It's the same word, only in the negative. So it's like he could say he doesn't believe it or he doesn't have faith in it, but it means he has, that both are not there. Somehow. I don't know how to, it's just one of those concepts, but it's all over. Every time you run into the word faith in the scripture, and every time you run into the word believe, it's one word and somebody's decided which way they're going to go with it for you. But the context is always that they're somehow connected. And I don't even know how to talk about it. I just spent 5 minutes not talking about it. You get my point here? It's like, anyway, Jesus says, "Oh, you." So we've gotten into 3 words here. Okay, so on we go. Says, and he's had this cry of this condemnation of a generation. I said it's known part of the Hebrew experience. Jesus uses that. Some people say he's just thinking about the disciples there, and other people think he's thinking about the crowd and this man in particular. And he goes on to say, "How long must I be with you?" Now this is a really strong statement, which essentially says, to some they, that I have been with you long enough that you should have figured this out by now. It's like, and then he makes it worse. It is exactly what he says, how long do I have to put up with you? Now, remember, the crowd is a whole bunch of people This poor father with this, and then 9 disciples who just failed in exorcising a demon. So they can all take it personally, okay? They can all take it personally. I'm sure that with Matthew, he's thinking, well, let's see, I haven't been with you as long as the rest of them. I was one of the last ones to get picked, you know? It's like I've only been with you like 9 months, but they've all had a year with you. So it's like, and then he says, but Peter doesn't have any, he's not fussing about this. But Bartholomew and other disciples, Thomas, they got to think about, well, I've been with you for quite a while. And then he says, how long must I put up with you? Well, that's a rough one. There is, this is one of those moments when we have to give Jesus some credit for being fully human. I've never said that. I never said that to my kids when they were little. I thought about it, you know. It's like, oh, look at it. I'm thinking, let's see, you're 9, so it's like 9 more years, maybe I have to put up with you. But what he's got is 2 sides. First he says, essentially, I've been with you a long time. You should have figured it out. Am I going to have to put up with you for a whole lot longer and you not figure it out? It's like that. It's both sides of that with you coin. Now, and then he says, our translation says, bring the boy to me. He does not say, bring the boy to me. He says, bring him to me, still using just prepositions. It's interesting how this passage is almost all pronouns. I'm sorry, pronouns. He just says, bring him to me. It is a, there it is. Yeah, bring him toward me is what it literally says. The way we get later on in the passage, the boy, they use, the word is paidion. Is it do you have it up there? Oh, it's paidiou, that's a form there. Father of the little boy, yeah. So, see up there where it says to bring him toward me, pros, or that's toward, yeah. That word, it's a word for child, but pretty much in secular literature in the 1st century, that word meant newborn or really little. But clearly this is not a really little newborn child. He stands up when he gets healed. And he's got to be at least old enough to stand up. The word can be used to represent anybody under 13. Because you didn't become a human being until you were 13, and they used this phrase, responsible human being. Everybody loved their children, and everybody was kind to their children and saw them as the future and all that, but they didn't have any responsibility or say of any sort in the ancient world, particularly the Jewish world, until they were 13. And I know if you've been in the class a while, you've heard me say that there's all kinds of stuff that registers about the difference between 12 and 13, that those numbers are really important in the New Testament. But he says, bring the child towards me. And this is a moment where Jesus is going to do this. He's going to take charge. He's going to take charge. This statement is highly imperative. It's an order. Bring him to me. Clearly, the father came forward without the child. I'm of the opinion that he didn't want to bring the child out to Jesus simply because he didn't want to bring this child out and the embarrassment of the family and everything until that he knew something different was going to happen. But he says, bring this child to me. Now, the reason I believe that Jesus uses this very strong, under his breath, he's saying, you faithless generation. How long do I have to put up with you? And then he goes, bring him to me. Why? Because there was an argument over something earlier, and the argument seems to have been about whether or not Jesus has any authority because his disciples who are operating in his name cannot drive this demon out. And if they can't do it, then their master, their rabbi, he probably can't do it either. And the scribes and the disciples were probably arguing over the importance of Jesus in the world, period. And that's what we talked about the last class. But this is coming up now, and Jesus is going to say, I'm just going to take care of this business right now. Just bring him here. We're going to settle this argument right now, and it has nothing to do with what my disciples can do. It has nothing to do with what the crowd thinks about me or anything. I'm just going to do it right now. And he says, bring him up to me. And he says, so they brought the boy to him. Now, we don't know who they is there either, okay? It could have been his family, his brothers, or somebody else. But they bring him up to Jesus. And so now the whole scene. And we're going to find out later that the crowd is growing. In the Matthew account, it appears that these people, with the man and his boy, meet Jesus on the road as he's coming down from the mountain. Matthew remembers it like that, and that people then seeing Jesus rush to him. Peter remembers it slightly differently, but we all know that's okay, right? We all know that that's like big time apologetic for the veracity of the text, that they didn't change it because they're different and they tell the story differently, and that just says that nobody ever messed with the text to make him the same. It says they brought him the boy. We can't tell whether he'd taken him off to the side or whether, we don't know, but he says, but when the evil, and it's unclean, by the way, it's unclean spirit, and we don't have that. We don't have a natural, like when we hear the word unclean, we can think, well, you can wash yourself and get rid of that part. But this is not what we're talking about. This is a strong word for something that is inherently evil. Okay, fully, just so that you get this, clean and unclean. Clean means acceptable at a level to be used for godly purposes. That is the definition of cleanliness. Acceptably righteous, or in such a state that it can be used for godly purposes. Unclean means it is in a state which means it cannot be used for godly purposes. Thus, when people become unclean, in the Jewish law, they have to do what? Go through ritual cleansing so they can now go to the temple so they can be used for godly purposes. You see this? You see that whole thing? Okay, now that's the way it's working. And so when we call a spirit unclean as if this is his identity, that means he can never be used for godly purposes. He is completely outside of the ability to function in any way that he brings glory to God, or that he is part of what God calls his family or anything. So that's that spirit. And the minute he sees Jesus now, what he does, and this is an interesting moment, because it says he throws a child into a violent convulsion. In the Greek, that's essentially what it says, and he falls to the ground, and he writhes, there it is, perceiving him immediately. For some reason, the NLT leaves the immediately out. So this means, now just think about it, Jesus is like this, and the dad is right here. It's a big crowd, and out of the crowd they bring this boy. And I'm just going to say, let's say he's 8 or 9, okay? Let's just say he's that age. And immediately, that is important, because the moment that he comes out of the crowd and they can see one another, this demon responds immediately. It convulses him, it says, that's a really bad, it convulses him and it knocks him to the ground, and he's rolling around on the ground and he's foaming at the mouth, and people go immediately to the notion that this is an epileptic seizure. And they'll say, well, the crowd and all of the people there in the moment was so upsetting and exciting that he had an epileptic seizure. Well, and I've said this last week, but we have to keep this in mind. The ancients knew the difference between epilepsy. They talked about it as a disease, and and the responses of people who are demon-possessed, they absolutely knew the difference. And this demon, for some reason, is either, one, he is arrogantly confronting Jesus to say, look at what I can do, and there's nothing you can do about it. Could be one thing. Or he could be scared to death, and the response of coming face to face with Jesus is that he responds in the most violent of convulsive ways within this boy's body and causes that to happen. But I think it's the first. I think what he does is he goes, because Jesus is in a moment of taking control. And the one thing that the dark spirits of the world want us to think is that they are in control. And they will do anything to make us afraid of their power because they want us to think that we are working against a foe we can never defeat. And the worst thing that can happen in this moment to that whole crowd and everything is for this little boy to immediately bust into these horrible displays of the demon's control over this little boy's body. Now, this is a big moment, because if this is the case, this is arrogance at its height. It's like, oh yeah, well the dad described it to you, but I'm going to show you what I can do, and your disciples couldn't do a thing about it. Try, Jesus. Also, it shows this spirit's dark intent. This is a little boy. This is a little boy. And he's perfectly willing to do this to this little boy, to breed fear in the world and fearful respect for him. This is when I think, and I am confident that when Jesus said, remember when he said, how long have I been with you? Then he says, how long do I have to put up with this? Part of it with you, but part of it is, how long do I have to put up with a world where this happens to children? The reason he's so adamant, bring him up to me right now, is because he's saying, I'm going to stop this nonsense. Because the last thing that Jesus wants to have happening in his world is that children are suffering this way from the dark forces of the world who have been unleashed into the world due to sin. He's just done with it. This makes sense? I hope this makes sense. He says, bring the boy to me. I mean, this is a terrible picture. It's a terrible picture. And I am confident what's going to happen next will tell us where Jesus' heart is. It's an interesting, what he says is very interesting. But in their world, even in our world, I mean, I know that, can you imagine if this happened within our congregation? That we've had some spiritual battles with people who clearly had opened themselves up to spiritual things that are dark in the past. But this is a little boy. Jesus is going to ask in a minute, and I'll stop with it because you guys need a break. We've been going for 40 minutes nonstop here. But by the way, I think that I can get all the preachers at Grace to now only preach 25 minutes or less, it says, because I've heard that our new attention span is 12 minutes, that 7 minutes is optimum for attention spans. Now, we are all older, but our children's children, their attention span is really short. So it's like this class would not work for junior hires. And they'll carry that with them, too, by the way. So anyway, what was I saying? Oh, what was I saying? Oh, what was I saying? I was going to say something about Oh, he's going to say something interesting in a minute. He's going to, oh yeah, how long has this been going on? The reason he's going to ask that for two reasons, and I'll get to them in a minute, but the one is, how dare you do this to a child who could not possibly have asked for it in any way? Almost everybody that I've dealt with who we believe have some sort of demon oppression have asked for it in some manner in their life. We can find out by talking to them why this would be happening to them. But this is a little boy. He didn't make a deal with the devil. Now, you could say his parents might have done something, but we don't get any indication of that. This is a demon who has absolutely no respect for humanity. And again, and I don't want to go on about this, but the one thing that I am confident about is that the world of the fallen angels that we call the demon world, they hate us. And they hate us with a passion that we cannot understand. And there's a reason they hate us. And here's the reason. We were created a little bit below them. They have some sort of existential nature that is above us in the panoply of life. They can do things and function in a way that we can't. They also were not created as finite creatures. They seem to be able to exist a long time. They also were created in the presence of God, and all of them saw God face to face at some time before they fell. And since they were created face to face with God, and they had seen him as he truly is, for who knows how long in eternity past, God has no grace for them because they have no excuse for denying his goodness and turning against him. We do not see him face to face. We, because of the fallen nature of the world, have to have this faith thing we weren't created for, and so we have no capacity to live in the manner that the angels could or can, because we've never seen God face to face to know who he truly is, nor have we lived for some period of time in his presence. And so God, because of our lower nature, gives us grace. And then the demons of the world cannot tell the difference between the animals and us, because we act more like animals than we do like God. And so they cannot figure out why God would offer us grace and give us an opportunity for forgiveness for the very same things that they do, which are rebel against God and want it their own ways. Is this making sense? Is it making sense here? And so when a demon comes into the world and he sees an opening to get into a child and make him miserable and ruin a family and make everybody afraid of him and look like he's in charge of everything, he will do it because he hates us, because he knows in the end we get grace. He doesn't, and he's doomed eventually, and so they hate us. Does this make sense? Okay, let's take a break. That's 45 minutes of whatever. I think, what we get, like 3 verses or something? I'm sorry. Yeah, take 5 and we'll come back. So yeah, I was just yakking away up here. You got to stop me from. Anyway, yeah, the problem is it's expensive. Yeah, so, but I'm practiced. But we have 5 songs based out. Like we have the foundations of 5 songs, and we got to bring in the fiddle players and the bagpipe players and the tin whistle players. And are we going to bring in CDs? They don't make CDs anymore. You know, this is the first year in like I don't know how many years. This last year that they sold more vinyl than all other forms of like CDs, cassettes, anything like that put together. They sold more vinyl, so.
I still have all mine.
Yeah.
You got your 8-track?
No, they're not going to come back to 8-track, let me tell you. Okay, I'm sorry I'm rattling on here. We'll start right up here. I just want to say this, that if this demon had truly been afraid of Jesus when he throws this little boy down and does this, if we can go back to the verses before, Jeff, just so that we can see what the demon did. But when he did this, if he'd truly been afraid of Jesus, appropriately afraid of Jesus' authority, and this is why I think he was not, he would most likely have hidden his activity in this little boy's body from Jesus. Because what he would have wanted was for the father to seem like he was lying about this. The demon the little boy would have suddenly been able to talk and speak, maybe. Or at least he would have been calm and there would have been no problem because now we don't have any issue. It's almost as if the father's confused or what's the problem here? Jesus sees this little boy and he's fine and nothing happens. Because why? Because the demon in him is scared to death that Jesus is going to do something to him, so he's hiding his behavior from him. This is why I do not believe he was afraid of Jesus, but contemptuous of Jesus, because he throws this little boy into the worst possible of anything right in front of Jesus as if, come on, do your best. I'm showing you you're nobody. And so I just think that if he'd been, I think that makes sense, that he would have make the father's story seem overblown. But Jesus says, he says, oh yeah, you can put the next one up, I'm sorry. He says, how long has this been happening? Now there's a lot of compassion in this because you can tell that Jesus is thinking not only about the little boy, but the father and the family. They didn't live like we do where husband, wife, kids, and we're separate and we occasionally come together for family things. They all live together. And if one man has a son like this, he has a wife this is the son of that wife, and they have parents and they have brothers and sisters who have children, and can I tell you the embarrassment that this would have been for that family in the community that they had a son that everybody figured had a demon. I mean, we even still struggle, nothing like it used to be, but we still struggle when people have epilepsy. We don't know what to do with those people, and it's an odd thing, and we're a little bit nervous around it when it happens. I can remember there was a kid in my class in high school who would have seizures from time to time, and all of the kids would like sort of try to get away because they didn't know what to do with it. Well, this kid is like, in the story, it's a mess. Jesus says, how long has this been happening? For 2 reasons. One, to understand how long the family has been struggling with this mess, and how long the little boy has been deaf and unable to speak and all this other stuff. But there's another reason too. It was a common belief in the ancient world that the longer you had a demon, the more difficult it was to get rid of it. And it was especially thought that if a child was demon-possessed near birth, it was almost an impossibility that anyone could ever exorcise that demon. If a child was a newborn or in the maybe first year or so, and it started to show signs that something was wrong and they felt that it was demon possession, they just assumed this was a hopeless cause. So Jesus says, how long has this been happening? How long have you been dealing with this? First off, because he wants to know what is he dealing with the family situation, and the other is this, that if the entire community knows that he's had it for a long, long time, their assumption is going to be, well, it doesn't really matter how good you are, Jesus, it's probably not going to happen. And he also wants to publicly have stated for anybody that's in that circle that we are about to deal with the worst of problems that we can possibly deal with, and that is what? A child who has had this since he was a little boy. And that's where we get the Greek word that tells us that is often used, as I said earlier, for a newborn. It's also used for children, and it's used in there, but that's what we're dealing with here. And he says, since he was a little boy. But the father can't help himself. The father is, I do not know. I talked about this with you the last class. I have one son. I can't imagine dealing with this problem since he was a little boy. Since it says this spirit, it's the unclean spirit, but the spirit often, and that's there, throws him. Now, the first time that he used the word throws, it says it throws him to the ground. The first time that is said in this passage, it's an interesting Greek word, which is actually derivative of a term for a dog tearing up a carcass. So when it throws him down the first time, it's saying that it is a violent, horrible event. Because just think about it. I mean, dogs, they didn't have dogs like we have. I mean, rich people had little dogs in their house, yeah. But their dogs were the garbage collectors of the community, and they were wild on the streets, and when they got a hold of a carcass, they tore it to shreds. Have you ever seen? Have I told you the story that we have a coyote pack that lives behind our house? And we had the family over with like 4 kids under 10, and we were all standing at our back picture window, and big boy coyote came into the woods we live on a big hill, and he came in, and all of a sudden he shot across our back woods and pounded on a squirrel that was sitting on a tree limb, or sitting on a log, and grabbed him and ran back in the middle, and then he sat down and he tore that squirrel to bits for, I think, just to show off. And it was terrible the way he tore him apart and had him down with his paws and was flipping him around, and I wasn't thinking of it then, but you know what? That's the word that he used in this to describe what happened to his little boy. Here, the word is just to throw, as in pitch, and it's all in a form that tells us that it's happening to the boy. And this is another proof that when he says the Spirit often throws him, it's as if the little boy has nothing to do with it. He is just all of the sudden thrown. And where does he throw him? Into the fire and into water. To do what to him? To kill him. It's to kill him. The word there for kill is a word that means to utterly destroy. Kill is right. But it's a violent word. It's a word that when you're going out to fight with your enemies and you hate them, you tell your fellow soldiers, the main guy says, let's go out and utterly destroy them. Let's leave nothing for posterity when we're done. And so what is this demon doing? Now, oddly, him trying to kill this little boy is counterproductive for this demon, because this is the stupid side of demons. If he kills this little boy, he has to go find someplace else to live. You know, they have a propensity to love human bodies, and I don't understand that, and animals. They like that. We don't have enough information to build a huge theological platform about demons, but we do know that they show up in people and animals. And that there is something about, they say straight up to Jesus sometimes, don't make me go back and wander in the wilderness. And so there's something about being inhabiting a body, because they can create more chaos in the world when they're in our bodies and something. But they can't get in there unless they get permission. I don't think there's some I don't know fully. But if he kills this little boy, he can't use him anymore. So it's stupid for him to try to do this, but he hates us so much that he's willing to try to kill him, because he knows what? If he kills him in a fire, that's good. If he falls into a fire, throws himself into a fire and dies, that family will suffer even more suffering. If he falls into water and drowns, it's a huge tragedy, and he would love nothing more than to kill someone and bring great tragic sadness into a family of human beings. And then he says this, he says, have compassion on us, is what he says. Have compassion on us, please. In other words, he still has some sense that Jesus can do something. And then he says, yeah, there it is. And then he says, but if you are able, help us if you can. Now, I'm just going to give this poor dad some props here, okay? He came out he'd heard that Jesus was here. He'd heard that Jesus was a miracle worker. He'd probably heard that Jesus had cast out demons. He may have heard that his disciples had cast out demons. I don't know that. They didn't do it in that area. But he had some faith, hope. He probably had no other thought that anything could help him. I'm sure they'd tried everything. He says, if you are able, have compassion on us. That's that word that, now I always have trouble pronouncing that word. It's splagnesthesis or something like that. See it there? That means your intestines. I don't know if any of you heard me this weekend, but I talked about the fact that in the ancient world, they thought that all your emotional, compassionate stuff came from your guts. And so every time it says he had compassion on somebody or he felt deeply for him or something, it's always a word that's really intestines. His intestines were feeling for this. They did not think that your heart had anything to do with your feelings. Every time you read about somebody doing something in their heart, that means they're making a logical decision. And that will change the Bible for you, because they believed in the ancient world that your heart was where you made logical decisions, where you made practical decisions. You thought about the evidence and you came to great conclusions. And so whenever it says something about your heart, they're not talking about your emotions. Because if they're talking about your emotions, they're talking about your belly, your intestines. And I said it in my sermon, I think, this weekend, but we think our brains is where all the stuff goes on, the logical stuff, and they just thought that our brains were just useless gray stuff that came out when they clobbered people's heads open, and they had no notion that our brains functioned in any manner whatsoever, because they couldn't figure out what it was doing up there. Down here they could figure out what they were doing, and they thought anything that's down in here is where your emotions have to be, because there's so much rumbling around in there. And up here, this is just a constant thump, and it's like, what? Practical action. It's a machine of purpose. So they use those images. Anyway, he says, if you're able. Now, why does he say if you're able? He'd come out thinking that he was going to get something out of this. The disciples had done something, and failed. And so the scribes are starting to argue with the disciples about whether or not Jesus has any true ability to do anything that he's worth listening to, because these guys who said they can do this because he said they could do it can't. And so what are you going to think? If you're there listening, you're going to think, well, maybe it's not as true about what they've said about Jesus if you've never seen any of it. He came to town and everybody said he could do this and that, but you've not seen any of it, and he's not even here. And then he's face to face with Jesus and he goes, if you can. I think I get that. It's just pure reasonableness in the moment, because I'm sure he'd been disappointed many, many times. You guys know how, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you how ancient exorcists work, and then we'll stop and can we start next time when Jesus starts like getting on it? Can we start there? I think that's a really great place when Jesus starts to get on it, because it's a really great passage. Ancient exorcists worked in two ways. One was that they had incantations. They were verbal sayings and patterns of speaking particular words. And this is true. This was not just true of demons, but it was true of the gods broadly. They felt that if they could take these incantations and they said them exactly right with the perfect inflections, then these powers that are out there have to obey us. Okay? This is what they believed. This is one way to get the gods to do what we want them to do, and when they didn't, they just figured they got the incantation wrong. And so they try again, and that's why they would say the same phrases over and over and over and over and over, hoping that one of the times would actually click in, and that the gods or the demons would have to obey, because they are controlled by language. There are certain commands that they cannot ignore because of the way they're stated. So you take your child with a demon and you take him to the demon exorcist, and one thing he can do is he can say these phrases that are in, and there are all kinds of books. I mean, we got a lot of this still from ancient history. We have a lot of magic books. And you can do that way. Or you can stuff really smelly stuff up people's noses. Jam things up in their noses, and they didn't put them down their mouths because you'd choke. But they would stuff they'd get these potions because they thought if they could get enough smelly stuff up in there, the demon would be just like so grossed out by the smell that they would run away. I'm confident that this little boy had a lot of things said over him and had a lot of nasty stuff stuffed up his nose. Now, we still have a bit of that. What are you supposed to wear to keep the Dracula and his, why wear garlic around here? Why? Because they just can't stand the smell of that. Well, where does that come from? It's a part of that from way back. Now, I'm just going to say this and then we'll stop. Jesus never cast a demon out by anything other than direct order, or not even having to say anything. And why is that? Because his direct orders are never incantational, nor does he do anything with any kind of material anything, ever. Why? Because he doesn't want to connect anything that he does in the authority that he has as the Son of God with any incantational or magical practices of earth. Jesus is going to ignore. That's why he heals people by just saying, go on home, they're healed. Because everybody had their healing practices that are all related to this magical stuff. And Jesus is never going to give anybody the idea that he's a part of the magical world. The big criticism, and I'll stop with this, of Jesus broadly was that when he was born, his family went to Egypt, And the stuff about them coming back and moving to Nazareth is false. He stayed in Egypt and he learned the black arts from a magician named Pantera, who was also a Roman soldier. Pantera, have you heard of that name? That's the name of a heavy metal band, by the way. You know where they're coming from. And that when Jesus came back, he had learned the black arts, and that he was doing it all with what? Incantations and potions and things that he'd learned as a black magic person. And there is absolutely no proof of that, because there is nothing in any record about Jesus doing anything that has any connection whatsoever to the black arts. And that's purposed. That's why in this story, all Jesus is going to do is go, get out and don't come back. That is not an incantation. Does this make sense? I just want to make sure, because I mean, it's like, okay, we're done. It's a good, so thank you, and I'll see you next week, and we'll find out what happens to this little boy.